Good evening and welcome back to this week's episode of Since I Was Young, a podcast dedicated to all things Heart of Midlothian. This evening you have myself giving my thoughts on the somewhat dramatic victory that took place against St.Mirren in the Scottish Cup, taking us into the next stage, the quarter-finals no less. Just one game away from a return to Hampden, which would be massive for Hearts. Certainly this Hearts side, I think, could certainly use a trip to Hampden, and the fan base would love it as well, of course. But as well as that, I'll obviously be talking about the upcoming league tie as we get back into league duties against Rangers. They come to visit us at Tynecastle on Sunday lunchtime. A slightly off-colour Rangers obviously turning up, so we will see what happens with that, and I'll give my thoughts and predictions towards the end of this week's show. Before we get started, folks, as ever, please do consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. Any support that we receive is massively, massively appreciated, as ever. And also, obviously, you can find all of our social channels down in the description. So if you are across those and you want to keep up to date with us and you want to interact with us, because we're active across all the social channels, please do consider following us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, and all of the others. TikTok's down there as well, most likely. But yeah, as I say, if you want to catch us, keep up to date with uploads and things like that, or if you've got any questions for us that you'd like us to address, as a few people have done for this week's episode, you can find us on all of those channels. So, with the formalities done and done, let's talk about St Mirren, the Scottish Cup tie. It was an important game for us, and I think when the draw was made, I felt it was winnable. I felt like it was a tie that, going away from home was always going to be a little bit tricky. But I have to be honest, the fantastic performance away from home against Dundee perhaps boosted my thoughts and boosted my confidence ahead of the visit to St Mirren. But they're always a little bit of a bogey side for us. They're always a team that seem to raise their levels when they play against us. And I think, you could see certainly in the opening stages of the game on Monday night that was no different. But before we kind of go through that, obviously the team selection situation, Hearts made one change to the side that demolished Dundee, that being Alan Forrest in place of Musa Drama on the right-hand side, Critchley sticking to his 4-4-2 that we have kind of become accustomed to, and the usual suspects all featured, as I say, the only change being Forrest in for Musa. Critchley said after the game that it was purely a selection decision. There was no injury to Musa. There's no concerns about him. It was just a case of, maybe changing it a little bit, which is entirely fine. And I think, we kind of spoke about it, myself and John, after we discussed the Dundee game and how impressive that was, that Critchley was very unlikely to change his team for a tricky tie on paper against St Mirren, and certainly not one that we were going to roll up and win 6-0 in. So I wasn't surprised with the lack of changes. I think it makes perfect sense. It's the old "if it ain't broke, don't fix it," and we've found a formula that seems to work. So why would you change that? But as the game began, I have to be honest, there was only really one team in it, and that team playing in black and white, unfortunately. We struggled to get a foot on the ball. We struggled to kind of control anything. We didn't really have any control. And to be fair to St Mirren, they took their chance when they got it. They pressed us very high when we had the ball, very aggressive. And yeah, it was very, very difficult for us to try and find any sort of rhythm, any sort of flow, which you could tell was St Mirren's clear game plan, which was just to knock us off our game and play their way. I'm not a big fan of the way St Mirren play football, if I'm honest with you. It was a lot of lumping it over the top and hoping that their fast forwards could get onto it, which, to be fair, they did on multiple occasions, and we had Craig Gordon to thank for a few early saves that he made. St Mirren, though, took the lead through Michael Mandron. Again, it was a shot that Craig Gordon just parried, unfortunately. I don't think he could do a lot about it. He parries it out, and Mandron gets on the end of it, and Gordon's not got a chance at that point. So St Mirren take an early lead, and I think they deserved it based off the balance of play till that point. We, as I say, our influential players just couldn't get involved, which obviously didn't help. And St Mirren certainly stepped up and were very solid, I have to be honest. But they certainly deserved their lead, as I say. The only question I had at that point was, with the St Mirren press and the St Mirren aggression, did they have the legs to do that for 90 minutes? And I was convinced the answer was no, which obviously it proved to be as the game went on. But at halftime, obviously, both sets of fans, St Mirren fans, were delighted. However, probably slightly frustrated that they hadn't scored more than one goal. Hearts fans did what Hearts fans have done previously and let the players know their feelings as the players headed off the park at halftime with a chorus of boos, which, I've said it many times on this podcast that I'm not a fan of booing players off the pitch. I'm not a fan of it, but it's a way to express how you're feeling. And based off of what we'd seen in that first half, I think it was pretty justified, which was very strange considering the same side pretty much had demolished Dundee not that long before. So it was a bit concerning. But John and I had spoken last week about sort of complacency being something that we have to guard against, and maybe there was an element of that. But I prefer to kind of put it down to the fact that I feel like St Mirren were on us and they stopped our sort of ball players from playing. Really, Blair Spittle didn't have a great half. Penrice was Penrice; he did okay, but there were players that we've relied on in recent weeks and they just couldn't get in the game. Shankland and Kabangu were feeding off scraps. Kabangu in particular was trying to get on the end of things, but just wasn't sticking. The passes weren't working. And when we had the ball, as I say, St Mirren pressed us very well and made us kind of rush. And, in that sense that we then ended up losing possession and giving it back to them frequently. So half time couldn't come soon enough for Hearts to get in and reassess. The second half began, and the first kind of real event of the second half was Lewis Nielsen going down with an injury that Neil Critchley has confirmed as a dead leg. So we'll see, what the situation is with that. I don't really know the typical recovery time for a dead leg, but Michael Steinwender came on as probably by my last count our only now fit centre half aside from Jamie McCart. So we're down to two now, depending on Lewis Nielsen. So we'll see what happens with him. But the defender injury curse strikes again. But Michael Steinwender came on in the second half, and I thought he was decent. I thought he had a few shaky moments with back passes to Gordon that were slightly overcooked, I would say, and left Gordon kind of rushing to clear them away. And thankfully, Gordon managed to, but a couple of them were swiped into the stands. But I think as the game wore on, Steinwender sort of found his feet and seemed a lot more composed, and he's definitely got pace about him. You could see that, and he looks a very, very interesting acquisition. Obviously we saw the other new players, which I'll run through as the events unfold. But yeah, I don't. I think for a cameo for Steinwender, I thought it was pretty impressive. Did the job he was asked to do, and certainly looked solid. Lots of people suggesting, obviously, that the back four going forward could be Penrice, McCart, Steinwender, and Taylor, or Forrester, but most people seem to be back in Taylor. But again, I'll touch on that as we go. So to see Jamie McCart and Steinwender next to each other was quite interesting to see how that would work together. They had their hands full a lot of the time, but I think they did well and they coped well. And as the game wore on, they had less and less to do, which helped. But yeah, he's Steinwender looks an interesting acquisition and certainly somebody that I'm looking forward to seeing more from. But yeah, he was certainly solid throughout his appearance, which is really, really good. Obviously, that makes a massive difference. We then continued to kind of turn the pressure up on St Mirren when we started to kind of get a bit more of the ball and be a bit more calm and composed with it. We then took Cammy Devlin off. Cammy got a head knock earlier in the game, and I was a little bit surprised that he stayed on at that point. I thought sure, the concussion protocol would have been followed, but he did remain on the pitch for a little bit of time. I'm sure that the head knock was in the first half. I'm sure somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but he went off in the second half and was replaced by James Wilson, which led to a tactical switch that I would suggest probably one of the main reasons why we finished the game as strong as we did. As I say, Critchley stuck to that 4-4-2, but he changed it to sort of more like a diamond system and put James Wilson on up top alongside Kabangu, with Shanklin kind of dropping back into that sort of deeper striking role, that sort of number 10, if you will, with Benny being the anchor in the midfield. And I think that worked really well. I think it just varied it a little bit, and we got a few more players on the pitch that could carry the ball forward. And James Wilson is a man that can stretch defences, and it certainly made a difference. Another sub brought on another new face, and that was Sander Khartoum for his debut. He came off the bench for Forrester, sorry. And yeah, I want to kind of touch on Sander Khartoum. I was very, very impressed with his cameo. I certainly feel like he's a player that can develop, and the pitch didn't do our technical players any favors. I will say that it was resembled more of a cabbage patch as opposed to a football pitch, but I thought our players coped with it very well. I didn't even touch on a Kabangu shot that he had in the first half where the ball sort of bobbles up and he manages to hit it, and he almost puts it away. The goalkeeper has to make a good save. So they adapted well to the surface. I think the new players won't have played on many surfaces like that. Certainly not Steinvender and Khartoum, I would imagine, haven't played on cabbage patch pitches like that. So for them to show their sort of composure and quality on the ball in that situation bodes well. If you can play on a rubbish pitch like that, then surely you can play on a far better pitch like Tynecastle. But sort of observations on Khartoum, I really liked what I saw. I think he's got an element of, as I say, calm and composed, nature to him, and he seems to just be very reserved with the ball. He was trying little sort of slide rule passes that just weren't finding teammates, but you're looking at it going, well, at least he's trying something, at least he's carrying the ball forward and doing something. And he has this sort of his gait, he kind of glides across the pitch, which is something that I really liked about him. It was something that I noted. I feel like he's a player that will only get better the more he plays, and the more fit he becomes, the more match fit he becomes. Because Neil Critchley had spoken about it, about him and Steinvender, talking about they're having to go through a sort of pre-season program almost, um, before they kind of get launched in. Steinvender obviously came off the bench due to injury. Khartoum comes on as part of a tactical change, and I thought Khartoum did very well. You can let me know what you think about Sander Khartoum's little cameo in the game, and I think again Neil Critchley summed it up very well that for Steinvender and Khartoum, it was actually quite good that the game went to extra time because it gave them more minutes on the pitch and it builds their match fitness, which is something that they're obviously both lacking due to coming to us from leagues that finished in November, December. So for them, the more minutes, the merrier ultimately. So I felt like both those two looked very, very good. The man that made the biggest difference, though, was the returning Australian, the forgotten man, Callum Nieuwenhof. He came off the bench for Blair Spittle. And as I said, I didn't think Blair Spittle had a brilliant game, to be honest, but I think he was a victim of kind of being shut down by St Mirren. They clearly did their homework on that left hand side. But yeah, Nieuwenhof comes on, and again, we spoke about um, John and I spoke about in the last episode about Boateng being sold and kind of what the repercussions of that are. And I think Nieuwenhof coming back would have played into the thought process of why we let Boateng go. I think Nieuwenhof is much more of the profile of the midfielder that Neil Critchley wants to work with. And he comes off the bench for his first appearance in 11 months after multiple hamstring injuries, multiple recurring hamstring injuries that he suffered over the last few months. And he looked solid. Obviously it helped with his first touch that he scores. Now the goal itself, the 1-1, the equaliser, I thought Penrice did really well on the edge of the box to just keep the ball. He kept it very well away from the St Mirren defence, who by this point just looked flat on their feet, if I'm honest. He does well. He finds James Wilson, and something about James Wilson that I'll touch on later as well is the maturity and the composure to find, to look up. And it would have been very, very easy for him, especially at the time of the goal as well. It came late in the game. It was right before full time. It would have been very, very easy for James Wilson to just look up and lash it into the box with no thought, and it would have been cleared by a St Mirren player, and we could have been out the cup at that point. But what James Wilson does is something I really liked. He puts his foot on the ball and he looks up and he says, right, I'm just going to put it in there. And he fizzes it in. And okay, there's a little bit of good fortune for it to get to Callum Nieuwenhof's feet, and there's even more good fortune in the finish. But at least Nieuwenhof is there. That's what he's got a knack of doing. He's got a knack of just turning up in the right place at the right time and being in that position. And again, this is something we've not had for quite some time as a midfielder that's just going to get into that position and be a nuisance or just be an extra body in there. We've seen George Grant do it a few times. That sort of fits his remit. But Nieuwenhof was doing it prior to injury, and for him to come back and just kind of pick up where he left off was really, really good to see. Because obviously, I've been kind of crossing my fingers and hoping for a Callum Nieuwenhof return sooner rather than later, but with that sort of lengthy injury layoff, you never know the sort of player you're going to get back. We don't know what his fitness was going to be like coming back. We don't know if he was going to be as committed or if he was going to be as 100% or, as full throttle, if you will. Because a lot of players, when they get bad injuries and they're out for a long period of time, it takes them time to get back, not just physically, but mentally back into the swing of things. But for Nieuwenhof to be there, and ultimately he just puts a foot at it, and it's the old adage of, if you don't buy a ticket, you're not going to win the raffle. And I think Nieuwenhof does that. He buys a ticket, he puts his foot through it. It's not the cleanest of connections. It bobbles, it bounces, it spins. but it goes away from Hemmings in the St Mirren goal, and it sends the away fans all, I think it was 1,400 of them. It could even be more than that. I might have been doing them a disservice there, but it sent the away end into absolute limbs, because in a cup tie that we looked like we were out of, realistically, we found a way to get back into it and we found a way to rescue it. And, people talk about, being extra time penalties, etc. Getting rid of replays is brilliant. Having extra time, having penalties adds that little bit of drama to these things. And Callum Neuenhoff, I'm just so pleased for him. I'm delighted for him. It must have been a hellish time to be out for the length of time he's been out for and just sitting on the sidelines, not able to help. But for him to come back in and make that much of an impact was massive. So that was great for him. Absolutely fantastic for him. The other player that came off the bench that I wanted to highlight was Gerald Taylor. I thought Gerald Taylor came in. He was brought on for Forest in the second half, and he looked solid. I thought he was, again, he's another player that's playing for his future, be that with Hearts or another side. I think people tend to forget, because of how long he's been out with injury, that he is still only at us on loan. He's not a permanent player. There may well be an agreement in place for him to be a permanent player, or there may not. I'm not sure what the terms of that loan have been. It feels like such a long time ago since we've seen him properly. But again, he came in and looked good. Like I said about Neuenhoff, about players coming back from being out for so long, and how it takes them time mentally to come back. I think you could see with Gerald Taylor, as soon as he came back on, he's clearly been instructed to just get forward, get involved, and make a nuisance of yourself. And he did that. And it's nice to see that from Taylor, because that's what kind of endeared him to fans early on, before he obviously suffered his injury. I think a lot of fans just liked how direct he was and how not afraid to take people on he was as a fullback. And I think when you see James Penrice doing that on the left-hand side, having Taylor on the right-hand side to do similar is going to be huge for the Neil Critchley system. I'm not going to write off Adam Forrester, because I think Adam Forrester's a perfectly serviceable option, but I think that battle between Taylor and Forrester for the right back spot for the remainder of the season could be very interesting, as will Neuenhoff's return in midfield. That'll certainly shake things up as well. But again, I'll touch on that when I speak about Rangers after. We then had a massive chance to finish the game in the 90 minutes, or 98 minutes it became, due to some bizarre VAR calls that were delayed the game. There was a couple of penalty shouts, I believe, that were both absolute nonsense. So we had 8 minutes of added on time, and in that time, Elton Kabangu very nearly scores. And I thought the chance was brilliant. It was created obviously from Shankland having the composure in his own box when defending to chest it, knock it over his own head, and just punt it in the direction of the St Mirren goal. And again, like I spoke about James Wilson being mature, he puts himself up against Alex Gogic, who is an absolute brute, who always seems to do well when he plays against Hearts, despite being a bang average football player. But yeah, James Wilson puts his body in a position where he knows he's going to get wiped out, but he's going to try and win a header. And not only does he win the header, he flicks it into the path of Kabangu. And, like John and I spoke about last week with Kabangu's goal against Dundee, where he was in space and he runs onto it, that's what Kabangu can do. It's the pace that he has to be able to get onto the end of that was brilliant. And he does all the right things this time. The ball bobbles up again. He goes round the goalkeeper. But it's a good recovery tackle from Boyd Muntz, I think his name was, to get back and clear it away. But that moment right there, would have been it would have been, I'm not going to say daylight robbery, because I feel like that's a bit harsh, but we certainly improved as the game went on. But to win it in that way would have been crazy, really. So we had to then suffer extra time. And to be honest with you, in terms of chances in extra time, I have to say it wasn't a great deal. It wasn't a great extra time period. I'm never really a fan of extra time. I'm very much more a person of just go straight to penalties and get it done with. Because for the whole of extra time, it almost felt like, sorry, excuse me, it almost felt like neither side wanted to make a mistake. And you could see that, both sides sort of retreated into themselves a little bit. And what Neil Critchley did during extra time was bring Kabangu and Shankland off, and he brought on Vargas and George Grant. Now, I think that was a big call to make at that point, because obviously you're chasing a goal, you're the side on top at that point, because St Mirren's legs had gone. to take off Shankland and Kabangu, two players that have a good partnership with each other, and also two players that you would have probably put money on taking penalties in a shootout should it have gone to that, and replacing them with Grant and Vargas. And obviously that tactical switch was the reason as to why that was done. It was a gamble. It was definitely a gamble, but it paid off. It paid off, obviously, in the shootout. Speaking of which, obviously, we had the penalty shootout. And as I said about James Wilson, the maturity for a guy who's 17 years old to put himself up for a penalty, not only to say he'll take a penalty, but to take the very first one in a pressure situation, just shows the level of maturity of James Wilson. That is something that I think is should not be understated. I was reading an interview that Craig Gordon did earlier on, and he was he was talking about James Wilson, and he said, this guy's got a very old head on young shoulders, I think was the phrase used, and I think that kind of comes across. And he says, he contributes in the dressing room. He's not just a good young player on the pitch. He's certainly not afraid to say his piece in the dressing room as well, which is great to hear, because obviously we don't see these things as fans. But James Wilson took the ball for the first penalty, and I absolutely loved it. He, as I said, takes that pressure on his shoulders as a young lad. Maybe it's a little bit of youthful naivety or, whatever. He just sticks the ball in the net. He goes high. The goalkeeper can't save it. It was a very well taken penalty. The part that I loved the most about it is he follows it up and smashes it into the net again, to stop Hemmings from getting to the ball. And I think there was also an element of it kind of G'd up the fans. Obviously, the penalty shootout taking place in front of the travelling Hearts supporters. When Wilson scores that, the fans are obviously celebrating, but he lashes the ball in the net, and it almost gives them like a second wind, which was really, really good. And then, sorry, I'm just referring to my notes so that I get the penalty takers in the right order. There was Smythe for St Mirren, who took the first penalty. I didn't think it was a great penalty, to be honest. It was low. It was not a particularly well taken one, I didn't feel like, but Craig Gordon does what he does, and he gets down and makes a save. I'll hold my hands up honestly right now. Before the penalty shootout had taken place, or before it had started, as soon as I saw it was going to penalties, I thought we're probably out here, because Craig Gordon doesn't have a great record in penalty shootouts. And I know I wasn't the only one, because social medias were awash with people that felt exactly the same as me. So to see him save their first penalty was brilliant. Obviously having James Wilson score our first, it puts the pressure on them straight away, and the penalty taken, Craig Gordon gets down, saves it, and yeah, it was a very, very good start to the shootout. Then we had Kenny Vargas step up and score. Again, quite a close one. It puts it the same way as the goalkeeper goes. Could have on another day been saved, but I think maybe just the accuracy of it puts it in, gives us a 2-0 lead. And then Scott steps up for St Mirren. Again, Craig Gordon goes big and saves it, goes down the opposite way from the previous one, saves it, celebrates. This guy is 42 years old and he's pulling out penalty saves. I saw in the same interview that I read today, it was in the Evening News, he spoke about the fact that at 42 years old, he's only ever, now I think the wording was something along the lines of, in a penalty shootout, he's only ever saved one in a shootout. He's never saved two in the same shootout. So for him to have done that and made a little bit of history for himself is quite nice as well. It was a good save, I have to say. I preferred the second save because the penalty was off the ground and Gordon has to sort of spring across to his other side. I think it was to his right hand side, if memory serves. Gets a good hand on it. He's full stretch and he gets a hand on it to tip it wide. Fantastic penalty save, and again the Hearts fans start to believe that it's gonna happen. It's gonna be done. Then we had George Grant step up and score. Somehow he tried his best to miss it, I have to say. The St Mirren goalkeeper Hemmings channeled his inner Popadom Hans Pereira to wave the ball into the back of the net. I thought it was actually quite a decent penalty from Grant, to be honest. I think the goalkeeper maybe should have got a hand to it, or maybe a stronger hand, as I say. But I thought it was a decent penalty from Grant, and I'm pleased it went in. I think if it hadn't gone in, you'd probably have a lot of Hearts fans saying, can we just leave him here and go home without him? I think, to be fair, I think people will probably be saying that regardless of whether he scored the penalty or not. But that gave us a further advantage and gave us a 3-0 lead. Then St Mirren's best penalty for me was the one that was taken next, and that was by Mooney. He just sticks it in the corner and Gordon doesn't get near it. Good penalty in a pressure situation for them, because obviously they needed to score to stay in the game. Then we had Gerald Taylor, who I spoke about previously, and I spoke about how well he played during the game. He stepped up to take a penalty, and he took a penalty. And as soon as I saw his run up, I knew he was missing that penalty, and I'm sure I wasn't alone. I really do not like the short run up. I don't like a slow run up. I don't like a stuttery run up. I don't like a short run up. And Gerald Taylor does all of those things. It's like he walks up to the ball and he's waiting for the goalkeeper to go. The goalkeeper doesn't go and he telegraphs it exactly where he's going to put it. I said it when I was watching it that I felt like the penalty was saved before he'd even hit it. So that obviously that would have been the penalty that took us to the next round, but we still had obviously the cushion of being ahead. The final St Mirren penalty. Sorry, excuse me a second. Lots of talking. I'm not used to just talking myself for this length of time. I've usually got somebody to bounce off of, but the what proved to be the last St Mirren penalty was taken by their captain, Scott Fraser, who stepped up and scored. He scored his penalty, but the antics after it were what made me laugh, and it kind of summed it up, and probably summed up the reason why I was so happy that we won. Scott Fraser, or I say Scott Fraser, it's not Scott Fraser. Fraser takes his penalty and he scores it, and then he's obviously trying to delay the taking of Penrice because obviously he knows Penrice's penalty is the match winner if it goes in. So he's trying to delay it in any way that he can. He goes and squares up to Craig Gordon to try and get the ball back. And I don't really understand why, but again, it's all just shithousey tactics, really. So he tries to do that, and then the referee obviously tells him to back off. Then what does he do after that? He goes to the penalty spot to tie his shoelaces and scuffs up the penalty spot in the meantime. And as I've said to many people, I feel like that action probably improved the penalty spot based off of how poor the pitch was. But yeah, it's dark arts of that situation, and it was silly. Let's be honest, it was silly, and it was purely to try and delay Penrice from taking his penalty. I didn't like it, but again, it's one of those situations. If it was a Hearts player doing the same thing, I'd probably be laughing about it. So fair play to him. James Penrice steps up to take the penalty. The St Mirren goalkeeper Hemmings does his best to wind him up and put him off, and obviously with the delay of Fraser being daft and not knowing how to tie his shoelaces, Penrice has a bit longer to wait to take the penalty, but he sticks it away, and obviously Hearts progress to the next round of the Scottish Cup. He sticks the penalty away, and one of my favourite moments of the game was James Penrice scoring the penalty and proceeding to laugh in the face of Hemmings. It's basically a case of, you try and put me off, it doesn't matter, I've scored it anyway. So yeah, he runs off and he jumps into the arms of Craig Gordon, and they're celebrating, and it's absolute mayhem in the away end. So we progress to the next round of the Scottish Cup. The draw was made after that. But in summary of the game itself, I'll be honest, it wasn't a great game to watch. I feel like if you were a neutral, it was a good game because cup ties usually are when you're not involved in them, especially ones that go all the way to penalties. Wasn't a great game of football to watch from a Hearts perspective, but as Neil Critchley said after the game, these games are just about getting through. It's just about finding a way to win it. And we managed that. We managed to find a way to win the game. Players that I haven't mentioned that I feel deserve a huge amount of respect and a massive mention for the game and the way it played out. Benny Beningame, he picked up man of the match. He was everywhere in midfield. He sort of grew into the game as it went on. I was very worried about him having played 120 minutes. I was convinced they would have taken him off at some point. And maybe if Cammy Devlin doesn't get his knock, maybe Benny is the one that goes off. But I was really happy to see Benny come through that 120 minutes. Not surprised he didn't take a penalty. I think his leg might have fallen off. But yeah, it was a really, really dominating performance from Benny. And we're starting to see more of those, which is great. And hopefully we can see more between now and the end of the season. The new guys, as I say, Steinvender, Khartoum, very solid cameos. I think we've got two players there that are certainly improvements on other players in those positions that we currently have. So that's positive. Nice to see them both get a run out. Gerald Taylor as well coming back in, Neuenhoff coming back in. It all increases the options that we have available to us as we go towards the end of the season. But like I say, the cup draw rather, was made after full time, and Hearts have been drawn at home against Dundee. I'm happy with that draw. I was very pleased when I saw it come out, considering we've still got in there. You've still got Hibs, you've still got Celtic, you've got Aberdeen in there as well. And you've obviously got Rangers, Conquerors, Queen's Park in there also, and Livingston. So yeah, there was some potentially tricky ties, and I feel like being drawn at home against Dundee, whilst it's another Premiership opponent, it's at home. It gives us a big chance to get the hand in, as I said at the start of this episode. So really, really happy with that. All in all, was it a great night in terms of football? Probably not. Had St Mirren made it 2-0 before half time, we might have had a different outcome. But thankfully, these players just seem to have developed a mentality where it's gone back to that never say die, never give up kind of mentality, which is great to see. And we hung in. Craig Gordon said after the game, we hung in on there, and we and Benny mentioned it as well. It's a mentality thing, and you're never out of a game at 1-0, and we weren't. We knew we'd get a chance. And like I said earlier, St Mirren's intensity in that press was always likely to drop at some point, and it was important that we took advantage when it did drop. So yes, that kind of sums up my thoughts on the Scottish Cup victory against St Mirren. Please do give me your thoughts on any of the things that I've mentioned throughout that little monologue about the St Mirren tie. Please do let me know your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of the penalty shootout? Were you like me watching from behind the sofa? Did you have faith in Craig Gordon or not? Because please tell me I'm not alone on that. But now attention turns to a return to domestic action as we take on Rangers in the league on Sunday, lunchtime on Sunday. I wonder. I think it's interesting. I asked across our social media channels earlier today for any questions that people may or may not have had in relation to this game and anything else perhaps that happened. And there was a couple that came in that I thought were worth addressing. Firstly, Jamie, who sent me, it's at Jamie Daft Jim on Twitter. He sent me, how has your feelings changed positively and negatively about the upcoming Rangers game following yesterday's result? Anything you'd like to see in particular? I think it's an interesting point, and I'll kind of start with that. The second one is quite similar in wording, but goes a little bit more towards the squad selection, which I'll talk about as well. I think the results in the cup, obviously, our result against St Mirren was very positive, of course. The performance, not so much, but the result certainly was. We're through. Obviously, the flip side of that, Rangers played against Queen's Park and created an awful lot, didn't score, lose 1-0 and go out. So it'll really depend on what Rangers turn up on the day and what Hearts turn up on the day. As we've seen, obviously, we've seen us turn up away from home against Dundee and batter them 6-0. And yet we've seen them go to St Mirren and struggle to grind out a penalty shootout victory. So it'll really depend on which versions of which sides turn up. But I feel like they're certainly there to be got at. We're in good form. They're not so much in good form, and we've seen it this season with Rangers that they seem to be a bit fragile in certain moments, and we need to be able to take advantage of that. But that's something that we've not been particularly great at this season. For weeks and weeks and weeks, I remember, just go back a few episodes, we were talking about missed opportunities. We're talking about that's a game we should be getting something from, and we've wasted that chance. Games that stick out to me are, the Aberdeen 0-0, we should have won that. You're looking at the collapse against Ross County, the 1-0 loss to Kilmarnock when we played against 10 men and we lost to a penalty. And even in the bigger games, the Derby, we should be winning those games. And we've wasted big chances when we've been presented with big opportunities to get big results. And I think having Rangers at Tynecastle is a big game for us, and a game that if we approach it properly and we approach it right, I don't see any reason why we can't rattle them and get off to a good start, and hopefully try and take advantage of any possible fragile minds that might still exist within Rangers ranks after their embarrassment at the hands of Queen's Park in the Scottish Cup as they exited over the weekend. So it'll be interesting to see. I think Rangers will either turn up as a wounded animal ready to prove a point, or, like I say, they may turn up as that fragile side that are a little bit delicate. But we'll see. I think, at time of recording, Philippe Clement is still in the dugout, which I think is quite a surprise to some people. I think they thought that the result against Queen's Park might be the final nail in the coffin, but I would perhaps suggest that it's a financial decision to keep Philippe Clement rather than an emotional one, certainly, or a logical one, maybe is more likely. But yeah, I think I wouldn't suggest if it's been positive or negative based off of the cup results. I think I've looked at our form in recent weeks and our performances in recent weeks, and we've turned that corner and we seem to have momentum growing for us. And that's massive to have heading into big games, having momentum and having that winning feeling, but also having that feeling of like I said about the St Mirren game, not knowing when you're beaten and not knowing when you're out of a game, we seem to have that at the moment, and that is something that's invaluable, particularly against games against the Old Firm, because we know Rangers, if they turn up at Tynecastle and play the best that they can, it's going to be a hell of a game, and it'll be a tough, tough challenge for us. But we have to again take the chances when we get them, because we will be presented with chances. I don't have any doubt about that. But I wouldn't say my feelings have changed based off of the cup results. I think what has changed is what Rangers we will see based off of their exit, and what Hearts will see based off of the players, and the players that came in to the squad off the bench. Because it kind of leads into my second question. Let me just find it here. That came from Martin on Blue Sky. His question was simply: the starting 11 struggled on Monday night despite their fantastic performance in the previous game. Well, 10 of them at least. With the subs making the difference in the game, but fitness still being built up, how many changes are you expecting at the weekend? It's a very good point, a very good point. And I think, this sort of leads into one thing I wanted to talk about. We've said a few weeks ago that there are certain players that are guaranteed starts in a Critchley side. You're looking at Craig Gordon between the sticks because he is the number one at the moment. And as the Hearts fans sang from the stands against St Mirren, he is Scotland's number one. And I would not imagine that changing, despite the fact he is 42 years of age. The man continues to just be a phenomenon, really. So he's the number one for Hearts, and I think he will be the number one till season's end. What happens beyond that, who knows? But it would be amazing to see him go out with a Scottish Cup. But I mean, I'm not gonna get ahead of myself and tempt fate. But he's certainly the one guaranteed starter that you've got to look at. And then in terms of defence, I think James Penrice, his name is on the team sheet every week. If he's fit, he plays every week. Then you have Jamie McCart as the other centre half. The other centre half will be very interesting to see. I think it's going to be, obviously, it's a toss up between Lewis Nielsen and Michael Steinvender. Now, that could very well, at time of recording, I still don't know Lewis Nielsen's availability, but pardon me. Sorry. Let me get my breath back there. Steinvender could well come in and partner Jamie McCart. Obviously, we've seen him against St Mirren. He looked decent. He had a few shaky moments, as I mentioned, but he looked solid. He looks a player that will grow and improve with time. But Rangers is a big game, and they will have different threats to St Mirren, so it'll be interesting to see what Neil Critchley does. I wonder if his hand will be forced, and if it is, if Lewis Nielsen is injured, then his hand is forced, and he'll have to play Steinvender because there's nobody else. Or does he go with Lewis Nielsen due to that familiarity between him and Jamie McCart in terms of that partnership has played together before? Steinvender and McCart have only played, probably about 80 minutes, however long Steinvender got on the pitch against St Mirren. So that partnership it could very well be the long-term partnership at Hearts, but it is still very new at present. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Like I say, it may well, like I say, his decision may well be made for him if Lewis Nielsen is not declared fit for that game, but we'll see. And then obviously at right back, you've got that battle between Forrester and Taylor. Did Taylor do enough against St Mirren to show that he's ready to come back in and play against Rangers? Obviously, at the start of the season, Gerald Taylor's first competitive game was against Rangers, and he was fantastic. He was absolutely outstanding that day. So there's an argument to put him back in again and just say, do that, but better, So we'll wait and see. But I think the defence is kind of based off of that Lewis Nielsen or Michael Steinvender decision. And like I say, one way or another, that decision may already be made, but who knows? I wouldn't be surprised to see Steinvender start, because I think, although it's a big game and it's a step up from St Mirren to then facing Rangers, he's got to get used to these big games anyway, sooner rather than later. So depending on his fitness and how he responded after the St Mirren tie, I reckon he starts. I reckon we see McCart and Steinvender as a back partnership, and maybe Taylor at right back. But then you're also factoring that in and saying that's an entirely new right side of defence. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what Critchley does. And obviously we've got a week between the the Monday night game and then the Sunday lunchtime game. So there is obviously time for them to work on things and gel together. Midfield is interesting. In terms of systems, by the way, I reckon it'll still be the usual 4-4-2. There is another argument to suggest he could go with the diamond that we switched to against St Mirren. I think that would be interesting if he did that. I think that would be adventurous. It would be attacking. So he could do that. We might start with that diamond, which would mean Benny being the deepest midfielder. Personally, I think we'll see the flat four across the middle. I think we'll see Spittle back in. Despite a quiet game against St Mirren, I think we'll see Spittle back in on the left side. Then obviously Cammy Devlin, it'll depend again on his fitness and his injury. You know, he went off and Critchley's words was he wasn't feeling right. It sounds like there's a little bit of concussion there. He did get a head knock, as I say, in the St Mirren game, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with Devlin. Benny Beningame obviously played 120 minutes. If he's fit, he goes again and he plays again. Simple as that. He is our most influential midfielder in that role. So yeah, if he's fit, he plays. Who's next to him? You could have anyone in there. If it's not Devlin, you could have Grant, you could have Nieuwenhof, you could have Sander Khartoum, perhaps. We've seen, that he can play centrally and he gets forward with the ball at his feet. So that there are options in there. So it's nice and it's refreshing to have more options in the midfield. And it gives that selection headache. It gives that competitive edge to each player. Sorry, pardon me. But yeah, it gives that competitive edge to each player, and I think that's massively important as we progress towards the end of the season. You want, and John and I spoke about this last week in terms of competitive edge. You want players to be fighting for each other to get into the team. You want them to be fighting amongst each other to play, because it'll raise everybody's levels if it's competitive. But yeah, I would expect probably a midfield two of Benny and maybe Grant, because Critchley seems to like George Grant, but has Khartoum done enough to come in and feature? I think he has. I really liked him against St Mirren. Maybe I didn't big him up enough in my match recap, but I really liked Khartoum. He looks a player that has a bit of composure, a bit of calmness. But again, it'll depend on what Neil Critchley, how he sees it going. I wouldn't be surprised if we see George Grant purely again from that sort of familiarity side of things, rather than going a bit more adventurous and putting Sander Khartoum in. On the right side of midfield, I don't think we'll see Alan Forrest. I think Alan Forrest was brought in and given an opportunity against St Mirren and he didn't take it. Long-term listeners of our podcast will know that I like Alan Forrest. I'm an Alan Forrest fan, but even I have to look at it now and go, how many chances does a guy get before it's a case of, he's not working with what we want him to do and he's not doing what we need him to do off the start. Is he a player you can bring off the bench and have an impact with pace? Perhaps. Is he a starter? I wouldn't suggest so. When Sander Khartoum came on against St Mirren, he played off that right-hand side. And by all accounts, that seems to be where he's been brought in to play. So we could see Sander Khartoum play on the right if he's not deployed in the midfield, in centre of midfield. But there's also Musa. Musa could come back in. He has that sort of work rate to get up and down the pitch, which could help with Taylor. If Taylor plays it right back, those two could interchange quite well. Up front, I think you're looking at Shankland and Kabangu. Obviously, both were taken off against St Mirren. So yeah, I do think it'll be interesting. Obviously, Neil Critchley said about Steinvender and Khartoum in particular, and I think that's kind of what Martin's question was relating to. Those two players, Critchley's spoken about them sort of going through a pre-season program at the moment, and they're not fully match fit. But they've played well. They've played well in their little cameo against St Mirren. Those minutes will have done them good. Are they ready to come and step in and play off the start against a side like Rangers? I think they probably could. And the thing is, it's that old scenario of, if you need match fitness, how are you going to get that by not featuring in matches? So do you think Neil Critchley is going to bite the bullet and play them both? I think we'll maybe see one. I think we're more likely to see Steinvender start than we are Khartoum, just because I think we've got more options in midfield, more options that Khartoum is behind at the moment in terms of fitness. Whereas Steinvender is fit and is available and is a centre half, and we don't really have many of those. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we went with a 4-4-2, and it was kind of similar to lineups we've seen, rather than throwing all the new boys in. People have said, is Callum Nieuwenhof somebody that I would start? I wouldn't be against it. I like Nieuwenhof, and he's certainly come back and made an impact. But then again, do you save him for off the bench to try and make that impact if we need it against Rangers? It's a very, very interesting point. But let me know your thoughts in the comments in terms of that. What would you like to see Neil Critchley do in terms of squad selection for the Rangers tie? Before we go, obviously, just sort of quickly to rattle through a few comments on the Rangers tie. We're in form. They've suffered a bit of a disappointment against Queen's Park, but they're still a good side. And as I say, it'll depend on which Rangers turns up on the day and which Hearts turns up on the day. I've already spoken about that, but we'll see what happens. Am I confident heading into the game? If we turn up and play how we can and we get Tynecastle rocking off the start and we start well and we rattle them and we let them know they're in a game, there's no reason we can't take points, and it would be massive, massive, massive if we could get 3 points in this game, or even a point. It's that sort of game that if you offered me a point right now, I'd bite your hand off for it, if I'm honest. But I'd love 3. Let's try and get 3 as we try to climb into that top 6 and see where we can go, because the season is reaching its business end now. So it'll be interesting, and every point between now and the end of the season is vital for us to try and make a late push for Europe, and even make a late push to try and lift some silverware at the end of the season in the form of the Scottish Cup, which we are one step closer to doing as well. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there for this evening, folks. As I said, thank you so much for joining me, and if there's any questions you have or anything else, or any points that you'd like to raise based off of what I've spoken about today, please do feel free to drop them in the comments section. And yeah, we interact. I answer all the comments. I reply to comments and all the rest of it. So yeah, please do let me know in the comment section anything you want to talk about. Fire it in there and I'll do my best to get back to you. We should be back to normal next week, in terms of normal being myself and Ewan or John, depending on availability, to sit down together to discuss, hopefully, a win against Rangers. If you are going to Tynecastle on Sunday, make some extra noise, because I won't be there, unfortunately, due to other commitments, but make some extra noise and hopefully roar the team onto some success, because I'm fed up being the nearly men. I'm fed up with missed opportunities. Let's go into a big game and actually win it. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Have a good one. Cheerio.